If you take our present consumption in the United Kingdom and assume that everybody in the world shared that same lifestyle and the consumption that goes with it, we would need something like 3 planet Earths to sustainably secure the materials, the food, the fuels and the physical materials needed to run a lifestyle for the whole world. So we are at the moment living an absolutely unsustainable existence in the context of global equality. The real problem was the existing built environment, because something like 45% of all our carbon emissions come out of our existing buildings. 87% of those buildings are still going to be here again in 2050. If we look at the way we use carbon today, most of our buildings are fairly inefficient. So we've got quite a bit we could do there. For example, not all buildings are loft insulated to the best extent possible. Not all windows are double glazed. Not all rooms are draft proofed, and there are still cavity walls to be insulated. It's always easier to start from afresh, but I don't think that's going to be the answer. You know, if you look at what happened in Victorian times and the way our modern infrastructure was done, and I think that's a lesson for us all to look at Joseph Chamberlain in Birmingham and what happened there. The infrastructure that we now take for granted was put in place. There's nothing to stop us working with existing buildings. One could argue that we're slightly more sanctimonious about protecting old buildings than others are. Much of our living and styles and what's happened over the last 30 years has been done in an era when energy is thought to be infinite in supply and relatively cheap. In fact, in many ways, the next 30 years for the world will be an era of being much smarter and doing more with what we've got instead of being wasteful. If you take a look at the need to remake the physical infrastructure in which we live, and we're going to have to do something like that, much of that is engineering, but you know, in the proverbial statement, you can take a horse to water, but it won't drink unless it's thirsty. So one of the things we have to do at the same time is to get a change in personal behaviour and attitudes to a position where we are now, that energy is cheap and plentiful, to a point where profligate use of energy is considered deeply antisocial. At the moment, the current government program is to encourage everybody to do it themselves. We have a lot of houses in this country which are in owner occupancy, I think something like 70%, and we're encouraging owners to go to Wicks and Jewsons and to buy things. But imagine, as we did in the past when we converted from town gas to city gas, from town gas to North Sea gas, it was like a military campaign where they went up street by street and converted the gas appliances. There are a lot of things we're going to have to do, and you can only look up the public discourse and see that we've got to clad buildings, and we've got to put more windows in, and we've got to have decarbonised energy and so on and so forth. But if you look up the website of the University of Salford or my own university, Cambridge, if you look up the website of the Manchester Metropolitan Authorities or Tesco's or British Rail or Parliament, what you'll find is that they all have a green agenda listed somewhere on their website. But nearly all of them run out of inspiration and steam and what they're actually going to do in about 2015, 2016, 2017. All of the current websites are focused on picking the low-hanging fruit. But I regard this total makeover of the infrastructure as more like a military campaign, and I would like to be very clear about what we're going to do in the 2020s and in the 2030s and the 2040s to get smoothly from where we are now to where we need to be. It is the case that if we go from the 65% of cladding and loft insulation and glass and so on to 100%, which would only take us another 5 years, what else is left to get us to the hard parts of the carbon emission savings from buildings? And there we find a problem. There isn't, if you look up the yellow pages, there isn't a section called retrofit. There is not a market for retrofit. At the moment we go down to Wicks and Jewsons and we renovate. I think we've got to get to a situation where there is a retrofit market. And I think the important thing there is not only that retrofit is a market itself, but that when the market is operating, there are new products and services to take us beyond the limits of what we can buy in, say, Wicks and Jewsons today. And I think a critical role there can be played by the universities in this country. If the universities as a whole, and indeed the further education sector, were to commit to Parliament and expect to be funded for the purpose, to get their own estates to these 2050 targets by 2035, by developing the new materials and the new building controls and the new ways of installation and performing the demonstrations on their own buildings, I think we're in a position to really help the country. And this could be a very important discourse between the universities and governments, that we're going to really help the world out of this series of problems related with climate, energy and sustainability. What I'm very concerned is that once the Copenhagen meeting is over at the end of this year, which was the follow-on from Kyoto, that unlike the last decade where we had a decade of more talk and more analysis, that we really go into a decade of unapologetic action.